Hey, my name is Chris Brennan, and in this video I'm going to talk about Mercury retrograde and what it means in astrology. All right, so Mercury retrograde is astronomically a 3-week period when the planet Mercury slows down in the sky and turns around and starts moving backwards opposite to its normal motion. So most of the time, Mercury moves forwards through the signs of the zodiac, and it moves past certain stars in the night sky over a successive period of time. But what happens when Mercury goes retrograde is it basically does a U-turn, turns around, and starts moving backwards or starts walking backwards for a period of about 3 weeks. So in astrology, Mercury is the planet that signifies communication, travel, and also technology. So when Mercury goes retrograde, it can invert the significations of the planet so that you get communication issues, you get travel issues, or you get technological snafus. So this is why Mercury retrograde is generally regarded as kind of a difficult period or kind of a challenging period when it comes to things related to the planet Mercury. So let's talk about some of the deeper things. So when you have a Mercury retrograde, one of the things that comes up is communication issues. So Mercury is the planet of communication and of go-betweens, and sometimes there can be miscommunication where the communication gets messed up for some reason. There can also be misunderstandings and different challenges that rise as a result of two people mishearing or misunderstanding what the other said for some reason. Another major theme with Mercury retrogrades is delays and setbacks, where Mercury, when it goes retrograde, it goes really slow and it almost stops in the middle of the sky, and it takes a while for it to get going and to pick up speed again. So as a result of that, sometimes you see delays with things happening around the time of Mercury retrogrades. So delays, there can also be detours where you're going to a specific destination, but instead of being able to go straight there, you end up having to take a detour and go somewhere else first before reaching your final destination. That's a very common theme. Another theme is setbacks. So you can be working on something, but then all of a sudden there'll be a setback that will cause the project to take much longer than it should have taken normally. So it can be kind of a frustrating time. And I think that's one of the themes that people often associate with Mercury retrograde is the feeling of frustration as a result of these delays and these miscommunications. Other things, things taking longer than expected, things slowing down. So if things had been moving at a brisk pace and you were kind of expecting things to keep moving quickly, suddenly you can find yourself almost in quicksand where everything's taking longer than you expected, which can be very frustrating and very annoying. I mentioned another major category is technological challenges. So especially in ancient astrology, Mercury was one of the primary planets of technology, and you can run into technological snafus, technological malfunctions. People run into issues with like computers breaking down or cars breaking down, and having just these weird things that come up all of a sudden that require you to either fix the issue or to replace the thing that broke down is a really common theme. Another major theme is travel disruptions. So Mercury is the planet of travel. It's the fastest moving planet in the solar system. So Mercury, when it goes retrograde, sometimes can lead to these major travel disruptions where like your airplane trip gets canceled, you're driving on a road trip and you have like a tire that goes out or something that causes you to, miss a date or miss an obligation that you were trying to get to. So one of the things that astrologers do sometimes is if they have to travel during a Mercury retrograde, they'll kind of like anticipate that there may be some delays or some travel issues and not schedule things too tightly because they're sort of anticipating the possibility of these travel disruptions. Another major theme with Mercury retrograde is revisiting the past. And so we've talked about mainly up to this point a lot of the sort of external concrete issues that can arise during Mercury retrograde, but Mercury retrograde periods are also can coincide with a period of reflection and introspection, and especially going back to and revisiting the past. because astronomically, Mercury, when it goes retrograde, it turns around and then it starts retracing its steps, and it goes back to a point in the past or back to a point in the zodiac that it already revisited earlier. It already visited earlier. So as a result of that, symbolically, Mercury retrogrades can coincide with the period of you, if that retrograde is important, revisiting the past or having things or people or situations from the past come back into your life for some reason. So encounters with people from the past, sometimes somebody you were in a relationship from the past or that you knew from the past, you'll start thinking of them again. Sometimes if it's in certain sectors of the chart, it can be like revisiting places that you used to live, revisiting an old job, reconnecting with an old friend, and other things like that. Sometimes this involves rethinking things. Once you revisit the past, it can give you more perspective on things and cause you to sort of reconceptualize things a little bit than you had up to that point. And then another major theme that comes up with Mercury retrogrades is doing something once and expecting that that'll be the end of it, but then having to go back and do it over again for some reason. Sometimes because either there was a mistake or sometimes because there was a technical snafu so that there was an error or your work got lost or something like that. So you end up having to go back and do it a second time. And sometimes the benefit of that is that whenever we have to go back and do something a second time, typically we'll do it better than we did the first time. And there might be some mistakes or errors or shortcomings in our first attempt, but by being forced to go back and do it over again, sometimes the final product ends up being a lot better than we would have originally produced otherwise. And I think that's one of the main themes of Mercury retrogrades and ways in which they can be constructive, even if there are some challenges and some stress getting to that point, that ultimately the end result can sometimes be necessary and even favorable. So, in terms of the Mercury retrograde, there's 3 points in the Mercury retrograde cycle. The first point is when Mercury slows down and stations retrograde. So this is technically the first day of the retrograde period when Mercury turns around and starts moving backwards. So that's called the retrograde station or the first station. When Mercury stations retrograde, it sets up a 3-week period in which it's going to be retrograde. So the next point in the cycle that's important is the halfway point, which is when Mercury is retrograde and it conjoins the sun, which is sometimes called a cazimi, when Mercury enters the heart of the sun. So this is a very important point in the Mercury retrograde cycle because it's the halfway point. And I've noticed that usually when people run into issues at the beginning of a Mercury retrograde, they usually you start to see a turn at the cazimi with the sun, and there starts to be a direction change so that you start heading towards some sort of resolution. And even if it's not fully over or fixed yet, when Mercury conjoins the sun at the halfway point, usually you start taking steps towards and seeing the resolution to that and seeing the sort of light at the end of the tunnel. Then the next important point is the direct station. So this happens about 3 weeks after Mercury stationed retrograde. Mercury will slow down and do another U-turn and then start moving direct again. So this is the second station, or this is when Mercury's direct, and usually most of the issues clear up by this time or are alleviated or fixed, and you start moving forward again, although sometimes things are still going somewhat slowly and still have to take a little bit more time to pick up the pace again to get back to where you were before and to start treading new ground. So that's the 3-week Mercury retrograde period. There's also shadow degrees, or what's called a shadow period, which is when Mercury, before the retrograde, first starts traversing the degrees that it will later retrograde back to. Sometimes it will start to set up the situation that you'll have to revisit during the Mercury retrograde. And then similarly, after the retrograde is over, there can be a post-retrograde shadow period, which is when Mercury is still traversing the degrees that it retrograded through. And once it clears those degrees, or not until it clears those degrees, are things fully in the past, and you're fully looking back in it through the rearview mirror, basically, so to speak. So the most intense phase and the most important one is the retrograde itself. It's just that astrologers of the past few decades especially have established that there can be some preview of the retrograde during the shadow period, as well as some residual cleanup during the post-retrograde shadow. All right, so one of the questions is, how do you know if a Mercury retrograde is going to be personally important to you? And there's two primary things that you can do to figure that out, because not all retrogrades are going to be as personally important to each person as they will to somebody else. So you'll have this experience if you pay attention to Mercury retrogrades over time, where some retrogrades really hit you hard, and all of a sudden you see a bunch of these themes coming up in your life really intensely in terms of miscommunication, delays, revisiting the past. But there'll be other retrogrades where they might not be as important. And one of the main differences where you can know if a Mercury retrograde is going to be important for you is if when Mercury is stationing and when it goes retrograde, if it's actually stationing retrograde close to an important planet in your birth chart. So especially, for example, if Mercury was going retrograde on your ascendant, or if the retrograde degrees that it goes through over the next 3 weeks happen to touch your ascendant, or even your midheaven or something like that, then the Mercury retrograde is probably going to be more personally important for you. So this is also true if it goes over other important planets in your chart, like your sun or your moon, or other planets like that. So pay attention to the stationary degrees of Mercury, especially because you know if it retrogrades over a personal planet in your chart, it's going to be more important. Another thing you can pay attention to is annual profections. So annual profections is a very simple timing technique where you just count from your ascendant sign or your rising sign, one sign per year, and whatever sign it comes to, the ruler of that sign will become activated in that year. So I have a separate video on annual profections that explains that technique more, but basically do your annual profections, and if it comes to a Gemini or a Virgo profection year, then you know that Mercury is activated as the ruler of the year for you, so the Mercury retrograde periods during that year are going to be much more important, and especially those stationary dates when Mercury stations retrograde or direct are probably going to be very important turning points for you during the course of that year. All right, so the last thing I want to mention is just Mercury retrograde has gained a sort of popular understanding lately over the past decade, where a lot of people know about Mercury retrograde because it's something that happens regularly. It happens 3 times a year, but sometimes it tends to get a little bit overhyped, and sometimes people treat it like it's the worst thing in the world or like it's the end of the world. But I did want to say that that's not really the case. So it is something that can be annoying or frustrating. Like, people never like to experience miscommunications or experience delays or setbacks because that can be frustrating internally. But otherwise, Mercury retrograde, it's not the worst thing in the world, and it's not something necessarily to fear. It's just something to be aware of and something to kind of roll with when it happens, and to go into it with the understanding that things may take longer than you're expecting. And if you do that, then usually you can kind of adjust to it appropriately once you realize that that's the game plan for the next 3 weeks, and then it's not really a big deal. So it is a good idea if you're trying to plan something and you're using electional astrology, if you can perhaps to delay things to not start like a major venture until after Mercury stations direct. That would be more favorable, ideally, if you're starting something brand new than starting a new venture at the beginning of a Mercury retrograde, since you know if you start it at the beginning that there's a greater chance of having to go back and do something over again, or to make a mistake or miscommunication that could be problematic. So it's true that ideally you might want to delay doing things until after a Mercury retrograde in terms of electional astrology. However, you can't always delay everything or get out of doing things, and sometimes circumstances will conspire so that you just have to start doing something during a Mercury retrograde. And if that happens, then you just have to roll with it and do your best and kind of understand that there's going to be some delays, there may be some miscommunication, but as long as you're more cognizant of it or more aware of it, you can oftentimes mitigate the worst case scenarios, or at least develop a greater sense of internal sort of tranquility and acceptance that this is going to take a little longer. I may have to do this twice, but everything's going to be okay ultimately in the end. And as long as you approach Mercury retrogrades with that that sort of mindset, I think you should do just fine and everything will be okay. So I think that's it in terms of the main things I want to cover in talking about Mercury retrogrades. So check out whatever my latest astrology forecast episode is, and in that I'll be talking about Mercury retrogrades, if there is one this month, and the specific ways that we expect this particular retrograde to manifest. Also, if you like the video, please be sure to like the video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. There's a lot of people apparently that watch the YouTube channel that don't subscribe to it, so that makes me suspicious, and you should definitely subscribe if you like this content. And finally, let me know your experience with Mercury retrograde in the comments, because I'd love to hear some different stories from people that watch the channel and from listeners about what types of Mercury retrograde experiences they remember from the past and really stand out to them in their memory in terms of times when the Mercury retrograde really hit hard and they really learned something about what that transit is all about. So drop me a comment in the YouTube comments and I'd love to hear from you. All right, that's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.